maybe you could repeat your question. It was about death and when I die and the ego dies. I'm just going from memory. I haven't looked at it since you emailed, but it's like when the ego dies, is that the same thing as enlightenment?
Enlightenment.
Because when the body dies, the ego dies, so therefore that's a state of enlightenment. And
Yeah.
hey, I'm not. Hey, there's no analysis or judgment or even knowing of what your comment means. So never never feel awkward to ask questions on anything, because all questions are just beautiful play. They're just beautiful play in all of this. This is play. These are three instances of life playing to understand itself, to look into itself. But there's no right or wrong. So, but what I would say from this viewpoint is that this body comes into form. It has it creates an identity through the instincts of the biology. The biology needs to survive, so it has instincts to survive, and then that gets tangled into thoughts. It's all fine because it's all life doing what it does. But the actual entity, the identity, the entity that is spun up into thoughts, it is just labels and words and thoughts creating something that the construction of an ego can hang on to feel safe in this biology, to feel alive, to stay. So the biology stays alive with the thoughts it creates, and it just clings to this. So it's got some point of reference. But all of that is just not real. It's not a real thing. It's just thoughts. This body has the intelligence to be able to look into itself, create an entity with labels and words and thoughts. And that entity actually starts to become believed in from a very early age. And then it's never really looked at again because society reinforces that that is a real thing. That's a real entity. I, me, you. They're real separate entities. But they're actually not. They're just mind constructs through this intelligent biology playing in itself. There's no difference between this energy and the air molecules beside the hand and the trees and the nature. It's the same energy expressing in different forms. And if you just walk in nature and you look at trees and you really look openly without thinking, without labeling, and without trying to understand and dissect your comprehension of what you're looking at, and I have to use words your and all this sort of stuff, but I'll just say right at the start, the idea of I, when I say I, and when I say you and your, they're really just a word of reference. They're like a summarization of the processes that are going on, but that's the only way I see I or you. I don't see I or you as a real entity. I don't even see this. I see what this does. I see what I, John, does, but I don't actually see it as a real entity anymore. It's vibrantly happening, but it isn't anywhere to be found. And in fact, when you go looking, you'll see that you can't find yourself. If you really look, just look. And most people don't want to look because it goes against that whole ego structure. The ego structure says, summarize all this stuff, reference it, give it labels, separate it in thought, and then that's your starting point. And that's what we call I, or the ego. But it's not actually a real entity. It's just a whole ball of thoughts spun into a tangled ball of a way of knowing how it is that this biology just seems to do. I don't often talk about my sort of experience of seeing, the breakthrough seeing, because every human being will be different. The complexity that happens in each human being is infinitely complex. So I actually sometimes hold back from talking about, oh, my experience when I awakened was this and this and this, because I just think it's misleading, because then people start to crave having the same experience and they try to say, well, I should do it like that too. And that's just, there's no one there in the first place. This human being just got all tangled up in its biology and life experiences. And then at a moment, through a lot of different things, doesn't matter. Everyone will be different. It got to a point where that just decontracted and it was seen through. But I can say that the entity of self is a beautiful play of thoughts. And I know you've heard all this before, Bernie, but it's always fun to have a chat and throw it around.
It's wonderful. It's amazing the way when you throw up a particular thought and all of a sudden it's just sitting there so clear. Amazing.
It is so clear.
It is.
It's so simple. So Raj, I'm just trying to get to your question really, which is when the body dies, does the ego die? And is that the same as enlightenment? And I would just say that what's going on here, so enlightenment is another concept that has been created by this separate entity of thoughts wanting to find a way out of being what it seems to have become. But it's not a real thing. This energy that is going on here is all we could call enlightened, the way it's happening. And the complexity of this universe. Did you say you were you're a fairly logical person, aren't you? You have are you in the science field or something like that?
Physics teacher.
Physics teacher. I thought you said something like that. I didn't know whether you wanted to share that, so I was allowing you to say it if you wanted to. But physics teacher, because you would be a fairly rational-minded human being, I would imagine.
Yeah. Very intellectual. Yeah.
Very intellectual. And I think I would say this character, John, has always been very analytical and scientific-minded and very like to dissect through things. And it's, it has its pros and cons as far as opening into this, but it just happens. There's no choice in any of that, really. The complexity of what's arrived there as Raj and John or whatever and Bernie it's just happened in the complexity of life expressing. And really it is the complexity of life expressing as these biologies in whatever way, with whatever interaction happens. So the entity that we create in thoughts is just a construct of thoughts and labels and words and society mixed with biology and intelligent thought. It's just that. And the universe, if we call it, I don't like to get into the words God and universe but just to summarize, the universe that's expressing in all this complexity, it seems to be doing it perfectly. So even when there's like things that don't feel right in your life, you don't know the complexity of why or how that's expressing. You don't know the complexity of what's going on because we as human minds have to lay everything out in a linear fashion, logically, with one outcome at a time. We do it all very quickly, but we need to understand things in a linear fashion. But this is it's like quantum, if you understand quantum. It's all interacting. And the idea of cause and effect is a bit like the human mind making past and future. Cause and effect is just a way that the human mind can say, okay, I can grasp that, I can chunk it off into an object that I can understand, and now I feel safe because I won't get eaten by a tiger that way, or I won't fall off a cliff, or I won't die. The body will keep functioning. So I know I'm going round and round in circles here, but I'm trying to get back to this idea of the ego dying and therefore enlightenment. Is that the same thing when the ego dies at death? Is that enlightenment? But there was no person really who was born. So Raj, or I'll just say John. It's been seen that John is a summarization of experience and effect and this whole expression playing. John is a summarized word for that. This is this. I am this. I, that I think I am, is this intelligent energy also appearing and experiencing through a human body. That's actually what's seen here, that this is all one. This, I don't see Raj. I see Raj as like a mask or a label or clothing. It's not a real entity, but it's the same. It's just life appearing there that way, with all the characteristics that a human being takes on to play as an identity in this. But it's not a real. So that there's no real person that is an entity that is born. There is life that appears for a while as this body. It appears and has all of these experiences, which are absolutely wonderful. So I always say, this isn't actually taking anything away from John, Bernie, Raj. It's not taking anything away from the specialness of that experience, that expression, that interaction of this beautiful, complex life appearing and playing this way, not taking anything away. In fact, what it's doing, it's removing the contraction and the constraints that are put on this open expression when it summarizes itself into being a delineated separate person, separate self. And what I'm saying is that separate self is only a mind construct. It's thoughts, it's words, it's labels, and they're assumed. They're assumed. They're taken way down deep. They become a very, very, very strong habit with momentum. And something that's been appearing, this is still leading to the explanation of what happens and why enlightenment isn't really happening with the death of the ego. The ego is that construct of assumed identity. That's what the ego or separate self is. So you can see that's been constructed in the mentality, in the mind thinking of the human being, which is fine. You know, this is the same life without an entity speaking about this and just exploring it and just interacting with the same life there, listening. It's not saying this entity, knows something. This is the same, exactly. Interactive. It's just the same beautiful energy interacting. You know this from some of the non-duality speaking. But the concepts that will play in this discussion still are, it's like these concepts are coming up to say, this bit doesn't make sense, isn't real. And that it erodes that, it deconstructs that. So this is really more of a destruction than a getting anything more. And so the ego, which is that remnant thought entity that's churning always, saying, stay safe, stay together, you're real, you are real. This is all happening in subconscious, by the way. It's assumed. You're real, you're a real entity, and it's churning in subconscious thought and holding on to itself. And the conscious mind, which is, who knows, 5%, 10%, the conscious mind, the thinking mind that we're going about the day and making decisions is, such a small slice of that. We all know that the subconscious mind is the bulk, is the iceberg. And all of that stuff in the subconscious mind has been programmed over a life, probably over generational inheritance of innate instinct is all there. And that has a very strong feeling of momentum of reality. And most of the time, it's not even being accessed by most people in the busy life when you've got this top 5 or 10% that's conscious thinking. Most people use that and just occupy themselves with life, with just going to work and functioning and interacting with other human beings. And they did this and I've got to, and it's, strategizing and politics and diplomacy and anger and all these things just use up that thinking mind. And when that's not being thought up, when that's not being used with those things, and there is some feeling of discomfort, like anger, just unknowable, because it's in this subconscious that's interacting and firing up. I don't like it. You're a separate person. You should be doing better. How did they say that? Why did that happen? Couldn't control. What's going to happen in the future? What happened in the past? Who am I? What am I doing? All of these things, I have to be better. All of these things are happening. They're firing in the subconscious. And so the very small part of conscious thinking, which is also an expression of this ego, doesn't really take the time or have the space or want to look at what this might be. And the conscious mind, it's like this big momentum needs to be tapped into with the conscious mind, with investigation. But that conscious mind will want to contract it into something it can understand. It's more like this fist that always wants to be contracted, kind of has to open to be able to be strong. It's very counterintuitive. So there's like this, I don't know whether you've ever had a cramp in your body. If you think about the cramp, it's like it's tensing up, and it's, who knows, lack of salt or water or whatever in the body. But it's like that. It's just for using this as an example. It's like that contraction. It's like saying, I know how, well, I don't know how, but if I just allow that contraction to be, it then lets go. And that's how counterintuitive this whole process is, because we've been thinking ourselves a separate individual self these whole years. Society's ingrained it and said, yeah, you are. Subconscious is like absolutely functioning that way. And then the conscious mind, through whatever, starts to open an idea. Maybe this is something different. Maybe there's something else going on here. And through meditation or inquiry or just living or spontaneous things or suffering can crack through this. And somehow I think these subconscious and conscious parts of thinking start to blend, and with an understanding of this entity that I keep saying I, without ever looking at, is not really there. And when that starts to crack open, if you like, that would be called sort of awakening in some way, but it might be conceptual or mental awakening. And when that starts to crack open, it's like that's kind of, I mean, it's all this intelligent life playing. There's no one doing that, by the way. The complexity of this interconnected intelligent life is doing that in that human being for whatever reason. A million variables have led to that. And then as that starts to integrate, it opens and contracts because it wants to know what's going on. And then it realizes that contraction is the opposite. So it opens more and then it contracts and it opens. And this goes on for quite a while until there is a time when it goes, oh, and there's no knowing. It just is that way. It's already that way. And it just integrates into itself. That's when the ego dissolution can happen. And then the momentum, so it's like seeing Santa Claus is a person in a suit, really. And then it can never be seen as real again. But this iceberg of subconscious conditioning will still play probably, because unless there's enough suffering for the mind not to go back into that identification, it will probably have a momentum that keeps firing up. It has here, but every time it fires up, and it still echoes, but every time it fires up, it's known completely, viscerally known that that's an old program running and it's not real. It's just thoughts that are based on conditioning. They're not real. And so that just seems to rewrite over time. That huge subconscious seems to start to break itself down and become rewritten. There's that expression. I don't subscribe exactly to this, but, there's that expression about to become an expert at something, you need to do 10,000 hours of practice. They say with musicians or sports people or whatever. Now, of course, certain people will be more apt and will adapt quicker. It might be 100 hours for some, might be 100,000 for others. But let's just use that idea that the subconscious conditioning has this programming, this wiring in the way the subconscious seems to see the world and identify as a separate self. And the conscious mind can interact with that. And through meditation, it can loosen that barrier and it can become a bit more malleable, and then it's seen and things start to open. But that conscious mind, that ego momentum that's been functioning in the subconscious, kind of needs time to be reprogrammed. That's what it feels like. And all of this doesn't matter. None of this matters, because there's no one there that it needs to matter to, and there's no one really there who's being deconstructed. It's just the play of life playing that way. So it doesn't matter whether it's a week, a month, a year, life, whatever. It doesn't matter, because this life will come and go. But the energy of this expression was always there and will always continue, just in different form. Of course, the mental mind of a human being doesn't like that idea, because it's my body and my life, and I don't want to die. I like being alive and a separate thing, but it's not even there. This is the part. This is the same. This intelligent energy that's experiencing, expressing, and playing through this form will continue, has continued. It's timeless. And for the ego mind to grasp that while you're a human being with a physiology, it will never want to let go of that concept for self-preservation. It just won't, because it's part of the biology. It's part of being human being expressing this way. But this human being really is just life, expressing for a while that way and then leaving. And the story of mind in that human expression will come up with this idea of I'm a separate me, a separate self, a separate entity that needs to stay strong and survive and persist. But even that is just a swirling energetic thought experience. It's not real. It's a real feeling, but this is one. There's no separation in this appearance of human being to anything else that's happening. There's just the appearance and the interpretation through biology. So there's that. So basically what I'm saying is when the human ego dies, there was no one there before the human ego died. The human ego is just a ball of interpretation in thought and energy. So you are already enlightened with that. It's already happening. And by the way, the word enlightenment, I very rarely touch that word, because it's too tangled up in concept. What is sort of being expressed here is this: whatever is known, whatever concept can be spoken across here, also needs to be let go of, because basically it should end up a confusing not knowing, which is counterintuitive to the human brain for survival. It's just the way it appears. So to die before you die in that whole story, I am me, so I'm a story, and I will die. The story will die. That's all that happens. And the story is the ego. So when the story dies, when this intelligent life looks through itself. And by the way, is this, I'll just rattle on. I'll get into a flow and I'll start talking like this. But it's very common, depending on where that human Raj has got to with looking into all of this. This could feel like it's just too much to comprehend. And it could feel quite, a very common response is fatigue, by the way. A very common response is these fight, flight, or freeze, or avoid. And one of those is people, if they start looking at this, will go to sleep. I can see you yawning there, and I don't know whether it's because my words are actually triggering your brain to contract and go, oh, there's something in this, but I don't want to hear it. I like it. I resonate, but there's also part of me that's saying I should avoid this, really, because this actually leads to my destruction. And the fact that I'm getting some response from you, I think is actually quite good. And it doesn't matter. This is play. This is happy play. Okay. There's no seriousness. If anything comes across that I know something, it's not that. All I'm trying to do is deconstruct what you think you know. So was that, I'm watching your face and I'm just wondering whether you okay?
Yeah, in fact, I'm very interested in what you're speaking. Maybe not enough sleep for me.
That's okay. I'm not having a go. It may not be that you might have just had no sleep last night, but I often watch people when I start talking, and I try to tailor what I'm speaking about to that person with the way they are operating. Now, when I say that person, it's really just a summary. But I've seen this before, where not necessarily you, but I've spoken to people before, and I watch them just dissolve into confusion. And I'm trying to be careful that I don't confront you too much as Raj at the moment. How are you going, Bernie? We'll let you off the hook for a while. Raj, how's that sound? We'll direct the attention towards Bernie. Bernie's usually got something interesting to say. Go.
I remember the first time I ever saw I Am That, the book by Nisargadatta. And I saw it on my dad's bookshelf and opened it up just to a random page and read a paragraph. And I can just remember thinking, this is absolute crap. And I put it back on the shelf. And then about 3 years later, after I had spent most of those years meditating, I opened the book again, just noticed it on the shelf, and just the whole thing was perfect. It was such a strange dichotomy between thinking it was absolutely terrible to thinking it was absolutely perfect. I don't know. Have you ever seen that? Have you ever come across I Am That?
Are you asking me or Raj?
Yeah.
I had my hair standing up on end, when you get goosebumps all over you, because half an hour before this meeting, I've actually never read that book. I think I've said before, I don't think I was really a seeker as such. It's never really happened that I've felt like I was a seeker. This kind of took me by surprise in a little way. I was a lot of suffering, which led this journey into finding a way out, and then meditation, and then stillness, and then opening happened. And all the rest of it's happened after that. And I was, funnily enough, I think it appeared in one of my YouTube feeds or something, and it was that I Am That. And this is half an hour before this meeting. So these synchronicities, I just go, bizarre things happen, right? And I was actually looking up, and I was going to purchase it on and just to have it, because I thought, yeah, a lot of people talk about I Am That. I suppose I should know what it's about, because it might be. I look for these days. I'm not seeking. This feels really open now, unknowably okay. That's the way it feels. It doesn't need to be known. None of this needs to be known. But when the seeking mind is still, in pain, trying to find answers and solutions and really quantify what's going on, I know what that's like, because I've expressed it. I've felt it. There was awakening-ish, I suppose, through meditation and just looking into things and suffering and finding solutions. The human organism tries to, find peace and happiness. And then there were just a couple of cathartic events that just went, oh, really? How didn't I see this the whole life? And then after that, it was like, I didn't say anything for, I don't know, a couple of years probably. I did to family, but they didn't want to hear it. And I couldn't express it, and I couldn't explain it anyway. So it didn't really make sense. And the rest of the time is just it just seems to formulate into ways to be expressed again. And this is just life, interacting this way, like these discussions are beautiful. The things Raj has said, the things you've said, it's just really helpful for other people to see that there's this concepts, these identities that are formed in thought. It's, great. Why not have the experience? This experience is happening in life this way, but it's not a real object. It's not a real entity. This I concept is just a swirling experience. It's a verb. It's just all the stuff that's happening gets summarized into this way of saying, well, all that stuff that's happening is like this in this biology does this. And we just say, I did that. We just say, I did that. And then that becomes so ingrained, like that 10,000 hours of habit, that becomes a habit that never gets touched again. And then it just gets assumed. And then everything after that is from I and you and me and separation. It's just the way it is. And it is also part of the way the human biology conserves energy. It doesn't try to analyze everything in a room. Every time it looks at it, it goes, I know most of those things. I can quickly summarize most of those things, and I'll look at the new moving things that I don't know. Or it'll and it does that with everything. All knowledge that's acquired in the human being will be acquired, filed away, kind of worked out so that experience is useful to future interactions. Now I'm saying past and future. They're not really. It's just a changeable now. We just have to use words like I, you. They're just summarizations. So really the changeable nature that was changed, that was appearing this way, and I have to say was because it's words, is just changing, and the future is just the same now, just changed into something, a different expression. It's just always a changeable energetic movement. And we just, in human minds, we have to say that was the past and this is the future. And based on the past, I kind of can predict what I think is going to happen in the future. They're all useful tools, but they're not real. They're just mind constructs. There's stories and ideas and imaginations that happen so that the human being navigates the world and stays alive, basically.
It's like the imagination presents a stable, familiar, simplified reality that works.
Yeah, and then part of that simplified reality is, okay, well, I've got that information. The brain in the background, the subconscious mind has learnt how to walk, that was already in my conditioning, how to breathe, that was already in my conditioning, that was already in my instinct, my actual biological instinct. And then there's all gradations after that come up to the next thought and interpretation. So there's all this gradation that happens from visceral instinct all the way through to interpreting the next interaction. And all of those get conditioned with different layers, different levels, different ingrained levels of conditioning, right from absolute inherited base instinct. A human being knows how to breathe when it arrives in the world, and pretty quickly learns how to walk, say. And the organs know how to digest the food, and all of these things happen. The eyes know how to blink. All of these are just complete instincts. And then all the way up to the latest interactions that say that person just said, or this non-duality stuff, is that right? Is that real? I always, this is all new information. And when the mind opens to it, it starts to seep into that subconscious conditioning and deconstruct it. And there's not new solid objects of knowing that that replace it. It's just stopping the contraction. It just erodes the contracted entity, which is basically in subconscious thought. And then that subconscious entity that's always said, well, I do this. It's just an expression of a summarization of this flow of life. I, as this flow of interaction of life, do this. I interpret that. But really, it's the whole that's interacting and interpreting, and it's known as that. So I don't really, the other day, I was just on the beach or something, and I was just sitting there going, yeah, it's funny that there is no believed entity anymore. There is no believed entity of I anymore. There's this texture and tint of life appearing as the character of John, but that's absolutely not believed as an object, because it's been seen and known, but it's also been integrated now. All of that subconscious conditioning, as it fires up, keeps firing up. And I can't really explain this very well, but it feels like that's being recalibrated all the time. And there's different ways that can happen. And all human beings will have different predispositions for how that might happen. I've spoken about this a while ago, but I saw some experiment about a lady who was a professor, doctor, and she was like a psychiatrist or something. And there were people that had absolute phobias of spiders or snakes or whatever. And they would take them into the first experiments. They took mice in, they'd ring a noise, and then they'd electrocute them or whatever it was. And so the mice associated noise with the fear of pain, and then they'd give them a drug, and the drug would stop that memory being rewritten. So some mice would feel the experience and go yikes, and they'd freak out every time they heard the sound, because they were going to get electrocuted. And the mice that were sort of given the drug after the experience had no reaction, and they would get electrocuted every time. It's all a new experience. So they didn't have this phobia, right? And then they took it into human beings, and they tried the trials with human beings, and they'd take people that had massive phobias of spiders or snakes or whatever, cockroaches or whatever it is, mice, and they'd take them into the room, and they'd say, now come into the room, and I want you to really activate that fear, right? Really lean into it. Have the courage to get it up to 9 out of 10. Like you're almost sick and trembling with fear. And then they gave them the drug straight after it. And then they tested them again. Nothing happened. They were still fearful. And then they realized that actually when they went to bed and the brain integrated those memories, the chemical that they'd given them stopped the enzymes reproducing the memory, and a memory gets drawn up, it gets activated, and it gets rewritten. That's why they say witnesses are only good in the first 3 days or something, because the memories draw up, and they talk about it, and every time they rewrite them, it's Chinese whispers, they distort them. They believe them, and they feel like they're real, but it could be he was wearing a yellow shirt and he had green hair, and eventually he's got a red shirt and brown hair, whatever, and they're completely, no, absolutely, I can see him. And they've written this memory in that way. So they found that the drug actually worked overnight during the dream state, when the mind integrates memory, when the mind rewrites all the memories. And this is a very interesting thing. I can't explain it, but it feels like there's something here where I don't really subscribe to the whole idea of interfering with the body, with the drugs and the mentality and all of that. But there seems to be something here when meditation opens the mind to be, if those experiences are felt, the fears, the phobias, the discomfort, and it can be ballooned to a point where it's like, I really don't feel good about it. It could be whatever, loss of a job, partner, health, whatever. And it's that fear and that hopeless feeling. If that can be ballooned up to the similar thing where you're walking into a room with a spider and you can't handle it, and you lean into it, you feel the emotion, and then go and sit down and meditate and allow that to really just integrate, burn, smolder. The most counterintuitive, all you want to do is not do that. In meditation, I'll often still, because this is all to do with that conditioning in the background, it'll happen anyway in time, but this can be a bit of an acceleration where you just, whatever's happening like that, you allow it to really, really burn openly. And it's so awful. It's like putting your hand into hot wax. It's not going to kill you, but you really don't like it, and eventually that just dissolves, just like the hot wax comes up to room temperature and it's no longer painful. The similar thing seems to happen with the energy just of emotion and feeling, which is basically what we don't like, smolders and burns itself out. And then it's kind of like, I can't even remember what that was about now. And it feels like that seems to get integrated. And perhaps during sleep, then that gets reintegrated, and this iceberg starts to be reconditioned. So the conscious mind can still be active in helping that, but that whole reconditioning seems to be the shadow work people talk about and all of these things. So that can happen. That's a very useful thing, either before or after, like seeing, knowing the nature of self, experiencing that. And nobody can tell you about that. That's a completely, the perspective has to happen in the human being. But those things, there's a lot of ideas that have just been thrown around there. But getting back to your original question, this is all to do with what is the ego? What is the self that is going to die and be and achieve enlightenment? It's already open flowing life. And the idea of enlightenment is another story, really, that's created from the perspective of separate self that is really just a ball of thoughts.
Yeah. It seems that when that process is taking place, when the imagination that the doer, the imagination of being a doer is believed, then there's also the necessity of kind of talking the doer out of it, talking the doer out of needing to do something about it at that moment. Whereas when it's seen that there is no doer, there's only happening, then it simply as it comes, it processes and dissipates and goes.
Yeah, and whatever happens, happens.
Mm.
Because the other thing about the pain and suffering that human beings cause themselves, and they're not really there. It's life really appearing this way. But human beings tend to say, oh, if I'd only known that, I would have done that better and I could have processed that. And if I'd changed the way I did that, or this hadn't happened, that would have been better. And I should have seen that, and all of this mind stuff that's happening, right? Imagine this is all intelligent universe expressing and appearing as multitudes of human beings and ants, plants and animals, whatever. And whatever's happening here, the complexity of why and how it came to be, which probably goes all the way back to if there was a Big Bang, but every complexity that's leading to the next decision or interaction from this human being, it cannot be
magnificent
for the human being to say, that wasn't right, that wasn't perfect. It's got to be more perfect in its complexity than this small, limited mind can even comprehend. So if you think you've got a better way of doing it, knowing from the tip of the iceberg, you know, how you can possibly shape the next thing based on limited, finite, contracted experience, have been like this. But actually, this complexity is doing all of those things, including those ideas that are happening about how you should be controlling it. So, you know, it's just a funny, beautiful game of open flow of life. That's actually what's going on. There's a beautiful open flow of life happening. And you don't need to understand anything at all. But these discussions happen. And this is looking into itself. And this isn't going to go, I got it. I got it. But this might go spontaneously walking across the field, might go, oh, this is what I am. This is what I am. This is what I am. And this is, wow, what an interesting interplay. The senses are really just looking. The miracle is that this is actually forming into senses and experiencing it and witnessing itself and interacting with itself. That's the miracle. The miracle that was seen here was how the amazing thing is this does this. This has this separated experience. How incredibly interesting, complex, unknowable, and fun and flowing. And so all of these ideas, you know, like some people will hear this and go, oh, don't say I'm separate. I don't like being a separate. I don't like you killing me. I don't want to die before I die. But actually, you were never alive. You're only an idea, actually. But all the experiences of being this expression and feeling and playing as this person are then free to enjoy the experience completely. But what you are won't die. The human form will just change and go back to dust. But what is animating and expressing through this, and the awareness, the intelligence that is playing through this form, it's unseparated, eternal, and the human form will come and go. That's it. The experience, the ideas, the thoughts that are happening will appear this way. It'll take ownership of its own thoughts. Wow. Amazing. How does it do that? I don't know. Just does. That's what it seems. That's what it looks like from here. And this is still interpreted and expressed through John, which is this human form. Anytime words have formed into stories, they're still just a story, but the story is really just supposed to play and resonate with itself, so that the stories in whatever heads are listening will go, wow, these thoughts are doing that as this expression in this form. and it can just loosen itself up, and then everything is okay, even if there is absolutely no comprehension, even if this doesn't feel right, even this is just too far out, even if this is like, yeah, that seems really logical, doesn't matter. None of it matters. It's just blending and interacting and interplay and the flow of life playing in itself. And yeah, it's just a beautiful open feeling of interaction that's happening here. It's not me to you at all. The me to you is really just part of the fun. You know, this this sort of appearance interacting with this appearance, but it's the same, interacting with itself. So you're already enlightened, Raj. But the bad news is you don't exist. to get anything from the enlightenment, you're not going to gain anything because you're really just part of this expressing. And it is enlightened in itself. And if you want to play the game of, and if the human being wants to play the game of becoming enlightened, yeah, beautiful. Wow. Feel that texture. Enjoy it. Play it. It might change. It might keep looking. It might change differently. Whatever. Doesn't matter. None of it matters. Except the suffering we create from that separate self entity trying to control the river of flow of life. And it just can't. It's like grabbing the river, making snapshots of it. And if I can just hold this flowing water in my hand, just take this snapshot and then understand it, I'll be fine. I'll be safe. I'll survive. My human instinct for survival will make sense of that with the intelligent brain that has developed to this point where it's sort of looking into itself, and I'll get it. And then I'll be safe. But if it's looked right back to the source, that I that wants to be safe is really just a construction of thoughts. Anyway, it's this intelligent awareness playing as an entity. That's all. Which is, when I say that's all, it's so much greater and more complex than the limited separate self-entity that's created in thought can even comprehend. So there's complete liberation in that cracking open of itself. And there's knowing in concepts, but not knowing but also knowing that they're just part of this play. So the knowing is an appearance, but it's not knowing of anything that's a real solid object. Everything that is appearing isn't separate. They're just appearances of various vibrating energy and table forms, air, black, dark matter, whatever. It's all just this intelligent energy. And as I've said before, just to really dig this hole a little bit deeper down the rabbit hole, even that is appearing as a physics man, you may well comprehend that this is flickering energy appearing and not appearing out of potentiality. So this infinite potentiality, before it even decides what it's going to be, is the potentiality of the universe. So have you explored the double slit experiment?
Yeah. And Libat experiment also, Libat experiment, double slit. Yeah.
So the idea that the double slit doesn't decide, the energy doesn't decide what it's going to be, object or, like particle or wave, until the universe, we say I observe it, but this is really just part of the universe observing itself. So until the universe interacts and reads itself, it doesn't even need to decide what it's going to be. So that's manifested energy. Before that, there's the potentiality, infinite potentiality that hasn't even seeped into material expression of form. So when you look at it like that, my little mind game of feeling like a separate self is so tiny and inconsequential. It's just like putting a label on something. It's just so inconsequential. And most human beings don't really have the time to look out of that tiny little slither of conscious thought. And when they do, because it feels awful and threatening to have the ego being deconstructed or dying, I don't want to die. So they'll find other distractions to fill up that conscious attention with sensory distractions, alcohol, movies, whatever, drugs, arguments, drama, and they'll fill it up so that that sensory thing can just be filled up. So it never actually has to even start looking into what really is here. So the thing is, just look sounds very simple, but every instinct of the conditioned, contracted idea of separate self will go, oh, don't look, don't look. So that's what I, most people don't want to hear those words, just look. It is that simple, but that looking has to be honest and courageous. So there's a little short answer to your question. It's only taken about an hour. I tend to do that, by the way, as Bernie would well know. Bernie usually leaves himself a good little window to have these conversations so he can get a word in, because otherwise it just goes on and on and on. But we've spoken about this before. Today feels particularly flowing. Sometimes it's a bit more staggered, but I often get off these meetings and it's been an hour and a half and I go, I think I said that and that. But the rest of it, I have no concept. It's blank. And the days are going like that these days. I had a day the other day where I went, oh, I think I had 8 o'clock in the morning, 12:30, and then it was 4:30. And the gaps between were all empty. There was completely there were like no thoughts. There was no necessity to do thoughts. And I'd driven the car and gone to the shops and done all, but it was just all in flow state. Like the body knows what to do, the conditioning, the iceberg knows what to do when you let it without the interference of the mind. And there's just a relaxation where it doesn't have to play as hard. And that was, there's no vagary. There's no lack of competency in doing any of those. It's just gaps of 3 or 4 hours at a time during the day, and everything still happened. So the mind is a beautiful tool. Fantastic. An amazing tool. The intelligent human mind is such an amazing tool, but it can be just picked up and put down. It's almost like when it's brought into balance, then the tool can function even more harmoniously and effectively. And all that's resonating here is in that extended silence that human beings don't tend to feel comfortable with. What popped up here was, look at the next thought that arrives. Because it doesn't need to do anything. We could sit here for half an hour in silence and it would be probably as effective now that we've had a bit of a discussion loosening up the perspective. That's more powerful. Because really, all of these talks are good to loosen up the perspective, but then there also has to be personal. When I say personal, it's just from this biology, this experience, really has to be personal experience in what it is. The perspective needs to learn into itself, needs to open into itself. And that can't be done with the words. So it's like, just after this meeting, just don't be too active. Don't try to think too much. In fact, don't try to work out anything that's been said, because all of these things, once these have gone like this, are probably more effective if they're just allowed to open into unknowable, into unknowing, because this subconscious iceberg will have heard it and will start to integrate it openly. If this conscious part doesn't try to say, oh, I know why that. Oh, I get what he's saying. Oh, I can categorize that. Oh, yeah, I got that. No, it should all be let go and just let this whole absorb, interact, and see itself. And I would say strongly that, quiet time, whether it be meditation or sitting in the garden or whatever you're doing, quiet time to not think allows this intelligence, the whole of this intelligence in this experience, to play in itself, to loosen itself, to loosen up the flow of itself. Because most of the time it's a contracted, controlling form that doesn't actually lend itself to just open being. That's what's going on. There's open, intelligent being happening. Awareness, words, consciousness. Yeah, that's what you are. You being the summarization of all these experiences. That's what you are, expressing as. And the human form appears for a while and changes. But what you are is this, experiencing through that human form. That's all. It's very peaceful. It's very beautiful. It's beautiful because the fear of death will still happen in a human conceptual form, but it's a bit like the idea of self is known not to be true. The fear of that death is really the body will just have its own compulsion to physically stay alive and breathe and have a panic response if it can't breathe, but it's really not. It's instantaneous. So each instant is all it is. And the big swell of thoughts before and after it, and the amplification of fear that comes from the identification of a separate self doesn't need to happen. So the visceral, physical, instinctive biology fear or anxiety can still appear, but it's instantaneous and it will be instantaneously changing. And all the rest of it, the perpetuating thought form of I, just isn't there. So the fear of death is diminished enormously. The fear of death in the thinking mind can be, I would be careful to say completely eradicated, because I think while a human being is alive, that thinking mind is part of the experience. So it probably still happens. And there's all that resonant history and conditioning that probably echoes, but the actual idea is so much diminished with the entity of self as it's sort of dissolved away, that also diminishes the fear and anxiety that come with the ego death. You know, there was an ego death here where it felt like falling off a platform and going anyway. And every instinct said, don't do this. So that was part of the decontraction that allowed the organism and the mind to think a different way, to see a different perspective. But these aren't just, I'm not just talking about concepts. I'm trying to explain direct experience that's happened. And now I'm trying to put it into words as John communicating here on Zoom. And but there's a very deep peace as I'm communicating this, because it feels like it's okay. It's okay if this is communicated well, not well. If there's reception there, it's okay. This is just doing what it's doing. It's quite peaceful when you don't actually, you can play in the thought of working things out, but you don't have to. So there's another option available, which is just being vibrantly aware, unseparated life, just being. And speaking of synchronicities, I just noticed that my camera just stopped working. It's like it didn't need to be recorded. It just stopped when we sat quietly. I don't know, memory card full or whatever. I don't know what's going on, but I look at these things, everything's interactive. Synchronicity is noticed so much more because it's not a separate occurrence. It's all billions of variables of complexity interacting, and everything is connected, really. So it doesn't surprise me when weird synchronicities happening, you know, Nisargadatta, I am that, and then you talk about it. Well, that happened somehow. Could be just a coincidence. It's the same sort of group. Just, we've never spoken about it before. Just appeared now. This card, you know, it's never happened before. But there was this stillness that, you know, I don't know whether you've ever sat with people and there's this stillness that happens that doesn't need to be understood. Like if you're just with someone that's just, you're just okay being like that, as that, in that moment. And it's very peaceful because, and that's what's really going on all the time. And that can be the base of functioning, that all the interaction, all the vibrancy, all the movement can happen from that base, as opposed to a contracted base that's never going to control it the way it thinks it should. It just can't. So
it seems like it's the belief in being a doer is what makes all of the trouble possible.
and that's just, it's not imperfect, because if the complexity of all of this appears and does that, one might assume, it's like a story, one might assume that the complexity of how that's spontaneously arriving is probably a perfect expression in the interaction of the universe. So that's why anything that can happen is happening. If you think it's not right, it's probably perfectly in harmony with the universe expressing. So then you don't resist that. And when the resistance is not there, there's a lot more peace. The resistance is just what causes so much angst for humanity. And you know what? If the resistance happens, it's probably the universe happening that way for some reason that's so complex we don't comprehend it. So that's perfect too, you know? And all of these things are actually, it's not perfect or imperfect because that's judgments coming from this mind again, but just relax and let it be, because it's probably happening more perfectly than can be comprehended in this limited, finite idea of separate self story. And that's enough. That's enough to just be and flow through life as this vibrant intensity. And then when it's free of the identification, everything, everybody you interact with in the world is interacted from a free state. And that's enough. You don't have to be anything more or understand anything more. You just need to let go of what you think you are, for everything else just to be as it is. It already is being as it is. It's already been happening that way, the whole life that's appearing. But all of it's just unfolding. And if that means identification, if that means pain, suffering, whatever, yep. But if there can be this understanding to start with, maybe conceptual to start with, that sort of the fact that three human beings that are appearing are just talking like this, it's already happening. This is already, it's already looking into itself. It's already doing this. This energy is already playing in this conceptualization, breaking down. There's one talking here that's just doing a different way, and there's different brains there interpreting, and oh, wow, it's already playing in itself. It's already massaging itself. It's already freeing itself. Nothing more has to happen. There's no one doing it in the first place. The doer is part of the appearance. It's beautiful. It's amazing, but it's nothing that we think of like that is real. There's real stuff appearing and happening and energy appearing different ways. Call that real, but there's no real separate objects and there's no real separate entities of me apart from this intelligent, vibrant energy expressing this way and flowing and interacting and playing this way. That's all it needs to be. That's all it is. And it's always been doing that, whether you know it or not. You might comprehend it as the story, but whatever, that's okay. Just another texture in the play, really. And words are just that too. All these words are just textures in the play. And none of them are real as objects. They're just twists and concepts in the thinking mind, playing in itself. And ultimately, it's just awareness and conscious energy.
I'm going to have to go, John.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go too. I have to be somewhere. I've got exactly the right amount of time. Raj, I hope you got something out of that. It's lovely to see you, and it's very, very nice to sit with you.
But finally, the final answer, does ego dies when we die? The ego vanish when we die?
So the ego is part of the energetic thought process that's happening through the human biology. So the ego, when the body dies, the ego stops because the ego is just part of the thought processes in the human interaction. But the ego is really just that. The ego isn't an entity. So yes, when the ego dies, when the body dies, the ego dies, but the ego can also die while the body's alive.
This is
and
what
some
you
would
call awakening.
Yeah, some would call that enlightenment, but the enlightenment is just realization that the ego was never really an entity. Bernie, you've got to go.
Yeah, I'll jump out. Great.
Okay,
To you.
good to see you, mate.
Yeah. Raj, I'll see you soon.
And I'm doing one next Thursday. You know, Hillary and the other they sort of said, yeah, please. So I'm gonna do next Thursday. I just had a bit of stuff in the last couple of weeks. So next Thursday, if you're around, I'll see you then.
See you then. Righto.
Yeah, well, see you.